The mayor fired an old groundskeeper in front of hundreds of veterans, then had him handcuffed for warning that a gunman was watching the ceremony. Minutes later, the glass podium exploded, and the man locked in the patrol car shouted, "Bell Foundry, East Roof!" At 6:17 on a cold Tuesday morning, Frank Mercer knelt in the wet grass behind the Rosewood Veterans Memorial, pulling crabgrass from around a row of white marble crosses. He wore a faded green work shirt, khaki pants, and a battered baseball cap with no logo. Mud covered his boots. A thermos of black coffee sat beside him, already cooling in the October air. To anyone passing through downtown Rosewood, Virginia, Frank was exactly what he appeared to be, a 63-year-old city groundskeeper whose back had been bent by years of mowing lawns, repairing sprinkler lines, and trimming hedges. He moved slowly. That was the first thing people noticed. Frank never hurried, never complained, and never offered opinions at staff meetings. He kept his head down, finished his work, and went home to the small brick house he had bought after leaving the army. The city had employed him for 11 years. In all that time, almost no one had asked what he had done before becoming a groundskeeper. They assumed he had always been one. Frank preferred it that way. He pulled another weed, pinched the wet soil from its roots, and dropped it into the canvas bucket beside him. A police cruiser rolled slowly along the curb. Officer Tessa Ramirez lowered the driver's window. "Morning, Frank. Morning. You coming to the ceremony Saturday? If they need the grass cut. You know you're invited as a veteran, right?" Frank glanced at the crosses. "Everybody's invited to something." "That wasn't an answer. It's the one I've got." Tessa shook her head and drove on. Frank watched the cruiser disappear behind a row of sycamores. Then his gaze moved to the rooftops beyond the memorial. Not casually. Never casually. He studied the angles of the buildings, the direction of the wind, the reflective windows, and the places where a person could remain unseen for hours. His eyes paused on the old county courthouse. 3 stories, flat roof, mechanical equipment along the eastern edge, a narrow maintenance ladder, clear line of sight to the memorial and nearly every street entering downtown. Then he looked away. The habit had followed him home from war. A man could bury a rifle, burn a uniform, and lock memories behind a door. But a mind trained to notice the breath before an ambush never stopped measuring distance, never stopped listening, never stopped watching. At 7:04, Frank finished the row and rose with one hand against his lower back. A black SUV swept into the memorial parking lot and stopped beside the fountain. Mayor Preston Hale stepped from the rear seat. He was 48, broad-shouldered, carefully tanned, and dressed in a navy suit that probably cost more than Frank's truck. Behind him came Miriam Cole, his chief of staff, carrying a leather folder and wearing the exhausted expression of someone who had already apologized for him twice that morning. Hale looked across the lawn. "Mercer," Frank kept walking toward the maintenance truck. "Master Mercer," Frank said. If you enjoy stories of courage, justice, and redemption, subscribe to our channel. Then drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to welcome you. Stopped. The mayor pointed toward the grass. "What is this?" "Morning, Mayor," I asked what this is. "Crabgrass." Hale stared at him. "I'm aware it's grass. Why does this memorial look like a cemetery in some forgotten rural county?" Frank looked around. The lawn was freshly cut. The hedges were trimmed. The marble crosses were clean. Flags stood in a perfect line beside the walkway. "Because it's a cemetery," Frank said. Miriam lowered her eyes. The mayor's smile tightened. "Funny. I didn't know we paid you for comedy. You asked. This weekend's ceremony will be attended by the governor's representative, state legislators, donors, local press, and 300 veterans. I expect this place to look professional. It will. Not if you're responsible for it." Frank said nothing. Hale stepped closer, his polished shoes sinking into the damp soil. "Do you know what people see when they look at you, Mercer?" "I imagine they see a man pulling weeds." Exactly. An old city laborer. A man who pushes a mower and empties trash cans. That's the image you project. I'm not sure what image you'd prefer. Competence would be a start. For the past year, Hale had been trying to turn Rosewood into a destination city. Boutique hotels, a riverside convention center, new banners on every lamppost. The Veterans Day ceremony was supposed to be the largest event of his administration. It was also a campaign commercial. Hale wanted cameras, donors, and photographs of himself shaking hands with decorated veterans. Frank was an inconvenient reminder that the city's veterans did not belong to the mayor. "You'll be at the ceremony," Hale said. "I work here." "No. You'll stand with the veterans. The cameras should see city employees participating." "I'm not part of the program. That can change." "Why?" "Because I'm the mayor." Frank's expression did not move. Hale gave a thin smile. "There it is. That look. You think because you wore a uniform once, you're entitled to something." Frank glanced at his hands. His fingers were scarred in places most people never noticed. "I didn't say that. You don't have to. Men like you carry it around." "Men like me?" Men who never quite moved on. The air between them went still. Frank had heard that judgment from men who had never stood within a mile of incoming fire. Men who never quite moved on. As if survival were a failure of imagination. As if the dead had simply been less adaptable. Miriam shifted the folder beneath her arm. "Mayor, we should review the platform layout." Hale kept his eyes on Frank. "Have the grounds ready by Friday. Wear something decent Saturday. The cameras will be here. I'll wear what I have." "Of course you will." The SUV rolled away. Tessa had watched from her cruiser across the street. She stepped out and approached Frank. "You okay?" "Fine. For a man who talks so little, you irritate him with remarkable efficiency." He came here irritated. "You ever think about pushing back?" "Against what?" "People who mistake quiet for weak." Frank turned the key in the maintenance truck. The engine coughed, then caught. "Most people don't make that mistake twice." Tessa smiled faintly. Then she noticed his eyes. For one moment, they did not look old. They were cold, still, and focused on something far beyond her. Before she could ask, Frank drove away. By Friday evening, downtown Rosewood had been transformed. Banners hung from streetlights. Food trucks lined the courthouse square. A temporary stage stood in front of the Veterans Memorial, complete with blue curtains, 6 microphones, and a backdrop bearing the city seal. At the center of the platform sat a polished brass plaque honoring the Rosewood spirit of service. Its inscription credited the mayor's office with leading a renewed commitment to military families and community unity. No veteran had been asked what it should say. Frank worked around the stage while contractors tested the sound system. He adjusted sprinklers, removed dead flowers, and swept leaves from the memorial path. Paige Whitaker, a nervous young event coordinator, approached with a clipboard. Mercer, the mayor wants you to move the veterans' seating." "Where?" "Behind the stage." Frank glanced at the folding chairs beneath the flagpoles. "Those seats are for the veterans. I know. They're in the shade. The wheelchair ramp is here. Mayor Hale wants the donor section in front. Put the donors in back." Paige looked toward the stage. "I'm just following instructions." "You're not responsible for the instructions. But I need you to move the chairs." "No. Please don't make this difficult. If you put disabled veterans behind that platform, they won't see anything. The donors paid for the event. Then they can pay for chairs." A man in a gray suit approached from the platform. A small American flag pin gleamed on his lapel. Colonel David Sloan, retired Army, now advised Hale on redevelopment and public safety. He had the polished confidence of a man accustomed to rooms where other people carried the consequences of his decisions. "Mercer," Sloan said. Frank nodded. "Colonel," Sloan studied him. "You remember me?" "I remember faces. Fort Benning. Maybe? Late 90s. "Maybe. Different days." Frank said nothing. Sloan nodded toward the chairs. Move them." "No." The colonel's smile disappeared. "Excuse me? The veterans stay in front. You're a city employee. I know. You answer to the mayor. I answer to the maintenance director. And he answers to Hale. That isn't the same thing." Sloane stepped closer. "You've been here too long." Frank's gaze drifted past him to the courthouse roof. A flock of birds lifted from the eastern edge, scattered, then settled again. Sloane followed his eyes. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing." "That's what I thought." Sloane walked away. Frank watched him go. Something about the colonel disturbed him. Sloane was not physically imposing, but tension followed him. His eyes checked exits. He never stood with his back to open space. Frank had learned long ago that fear and guilt often looked alike from a distance. At 9:40 that night, he locked the equipment shed and walked through the memorial one last time. The stage was empty. The veteran seating remained in front. The flagpoles stood motionless beneath the stars. Then something flashed on the courthouse roof. Only once. A brief silver spark, no brighter than a distant star. Frank's body changed before his mind finished naming it. His shoulders lowered. His breathing slowed. He moved behind the stone memorial without making a sound. The flash did not return. The night held the hum of streetlights and the distant rush of traffic along Interstate 64. The courthouse roof had no reason to produce a point of reflected light from that angle. Frank called Tessa. She answered on the second ring. "Frank? Are you near the courthouse?" "At the station." "Call the watch commander. Possible surveillance position on the east roof." A pause followed. "Are you sure?" "I saw a reflection." "From what?" "Optic, maybe. Scope or camera." "You want a unit?" "2. Quietly." "Frank, could it have been a window?" "No." The answer came so quickly that her voice sharpened. "I'll be there in 3 minutes." Frank ended the call but did not leave. He took a gutter-cleaning pole from his truck and crossed the lawn with the slow, uneven gait everyone knew. Near the courthouse entrance, he leaned on the pole and pretended to inspect a street lamp. 2 patrol cars arrived without lights or sirens. Tessa stepped from the first. Sergeant Nolan Briggs emerged from the second. He was a 20-year police veteran who disliked uncertainty and disliked taking advice from civilians even more. "Show me," Briggs said. Frank pointed. "Eastern edge, behind the ventilation housing." Briggs raised binoculars. "I don't see anything." "Neither did I after the flash." "How far?" 340 yards, give or take." Briggs lowered the binoculars. "You measured that?" "Not tonight." "What does that mean?" "Send officers up through the west stairwell. Don't use the elevator. Keep the courthouse dark." Briggs stared at him. "You're giving police tactical instructions?" "I'm telling you what I'd do." "Based on what?" "Whoever was up there didn't want to be seen." Briggs looked at Tessa. "Do it," she said. He hesitated, then took out his radio. 10 minutes later, officers reported that the roof was empty. They found no rifle, no camera, and no identifiable footprints. Only a narrow scrape in the dust and a black plastic fragment no larger than a fingernail. Briggs dropped the fragment into Frank's hand. "Nothing." Frank studied it beneath the street lamp. "Polymer. From what? Could be anything." "Exactly." Briggs folded his arms. "You have a history of this kind of thing, Frank?" Frank returned the fragment. "I cut grass, then cut grass." Tessa shot Briggs a warning look, but Frank walked back to the memorial without answering. He knew what the officers did not. The reflection had come from a coated lens angled toward the ceremony platform. Whoever had occupied the roof had chosen a position outside the city security cameras. The courthouse might not be the firing point, but someone was studying the stage. The next morning, Frank called the police station. Briggs told him there was no evidence of a threat. He called the mayor's office. Miriam answered. "Mayor Hale's office. This is Frank Mercer." There was a pause. "Yes?" "I need to speak with the mayor. He's in meetings. There may be a security threat involving the ceremony. Is this related to the concern you raised last night? Yes. The police checked the courthouse. They checked after the person left. Master Mercer, the mayor has full security coverage. Who is coordinating it? Sergeant Briggs. Has anyone inspected the other rooftops? I'm sure the police are handling it. I'm not. Her voice hardened. You are not trained in security. Frank looked through his kitchen window. Missers. Alvarez carried groceries to the house next door. 2 boys rode bicycles near a mailbox. A city bus turned at the intersection. Ordinary things. The most precious things in the world. Tell the mayor the threat is real. I'll pass it along. She hung up. Frank sat at his table for several minutes. Then he opened a drawer and removed a small black notebook with a cracked cover. Inside were dates, coordinates, weather observations, names, and brief sentences written in block letters. On the first page, beneath a faded date from 25 years earlier, were 7 names. 6 were crossed out. 1 remained. Frank closed the notebook. At noon, Mayor Hale held a press conference beneath a banner reading Rosewood Honors Service. Reporters gathered around him. Colonel Sloan stood nearby with several council members. Frank watched from the edge of the plaza while trimming a hedge. Hale spoke about courage, sacrifice, and Rosewood's commitment to those who served. Then a reporter asked about the security concern from the night before. The mayor smiled. There was no security concern. A city employee mistook a reflection for a threat. Our police department investigated and found nothing. Cameras turned toward Frank. He kept trimming. Was the employee disciplined? Another reporter asked. Mercer has worked for the city for many years, but sometimes people see what they expect to see. Several reporters laughed. Hale's smile widened. This weekend is about honoring veterans, not indulging fantasies or creating unnecessary panic. Within an hour, local news sites carried the story. City groundskeeper sees sniper on courthouse roof. Police find nothing. Someone posted a photograph of Frank beside a mower with the caption Rosewood's own Clint Eastwood. Frank read none of it. Tessa found him repairing a sprinkler head. You saw the press conference? Yes? You want to file a complaint? Against the mayor for saying I was wrong? For humiliating you. He's allowed to be wrong. That doesn't mean you have to accept it. Frank tightened the fitting. Saturday is still coming. Tessa crouched beside him. You really believe someone is going to shoot at the ceremony? I believe someone wants us to think there's nothing to worry about. That isn't enough for a warrant. I'm not asking for one. What are you asking? Keep the stage empty. That's impossible. Move the podium. Put solid cover between it and the courthouse. Hale won't agree. Cancel the ceremony. She stared at him. The biggest city event of the year? Based on one reflection? No. Based on the fact that the people responsible for protecting it are more afraid of embarrassment than bullets. Saturday arrived beneath a flawless blue sky. By 9 o'clock, downtown Rosewood was packed. Veterans stood beside spouses and children. Gold Star families gathered beneath the flags. A high school band waited near the courthouse steps. Vendors sold coffee, hot dogs, and miniature American flags. The veteran seating had been moved behind the stage. Black curtains and audio equipment blocked much of the view. Donors occupied the front rows. Mayor Hale had replaced the memorial's old wooden podium with a glass lectern, giving television cameras an unobstructed shot. It also gave every rooftop an unobstructed shot. Frank stood near a western flower bed wearing a dark suit that had belonged to his late brother. The sleeves were slightly short. Tessa adjusted the earpiece beneath her hair. You look uncomfortable? I am? The suit? The crowd. You were in the army. You must have dealt with crowds. Not crowds that clap on schedule. Her smile faded as she followed his gaze toward the rooftops. The courthouse has been checked, she said. By whom? 2 officers went through it at 7. The roof? The access door was still sealed. A seal tells you who opened a door. It doesn't tell you who climbed a wall. Briggs says we're covered. Covered by what? 6 officers, private security, and one man named Rick, who keeps asking where the green room is. Frank studied the eastern buildings. The sun was low behind him, creating glare across the upper windows. North of the courthouse stood the Rosewood Gazette building. Beyond that, the abandoned bell foundry showed a partially collapsed roof and several dark openings. The courthouse would have been obvious, perhaps too obvious. At 9:43, Frank saw Colonel Sloan near the stage, looking toward the bell foundry. The colonel raised a hand against the sun. His gaze lingered. Frank walked to Tessa. "Get someone into the foundry? Why?" "Sloan keeps watching it." "That isn't probable cause." "No. It's a reason to look." Before she could answer, Mayor Hale's amplified voice came over the speakers. Mercer." The crowd quieted. Hale stood at the glass lectern. Miriam was beside him, holding a sheet of paper. Sergeant Briggs waited at the bottom of the stage. Frank felt hundreds of faces turn toward him. Hale smiled without warmth. "Would you come forward, please?" Tessa looked at Frank. "What is this?" "I don't know." Frank crossed the lawn. As he approached, Hale spoke into the microphone. "For the past several days, one city employee has repeatedly disrupted preparations for this ceremony with unsupported claims of an armed threat." Whispers moved through the crowd. Frank stopped 10 feet from the stage. Hale continued. "The Rosewood Police Department investigated those claims and found nothing. Nevertheless, Master Mercer has continued alarming staff, obstructing security preparations, and attempting to cancel today's event." Frank looked at Briggs. The sergeant would not meet his eyes. Tessa stepped forward. "Mayor, this isn't the time." Hale ignored her. "Mayor." "Mercer, your conduct has become a threat to public safety. Effective immediately, your employment with the city of Rosewood is terminated." A murmur passed through the crowd. Some people looked shocked. Others lifted phones to record. Frank stared at Hale. "You're firing me during a veterans ceremony?" "I'm removing a disruptive employee before he causes a panic." "Then move the podium." A few people laughed nervously. Hale's face hardened. "This is precisely what I mean." "Leave the memorial." No, the single word carried farther than Frank intended. Hale glanced at Briggs. "Sergeant, remove him." Tessa stepped between them. "There's no reason to arrest him. He is trespassing on city property after being ordered to leave." "I maintained this ground for 11 years, Frank said. "I'm staying until these people are safe." Hale leaned toward the microphone. "You see, he believes he knows more than our police, our security professionals, and every official responsible for this event." The public humiliation was deliberate. Hale wanted the cameras to capture an unstable old veteran being removed so that every warning Frank had given would become a joke. Briggs approached. "Frank, don't make this worse. Search the Gazette building and the foundry." "Turn around. Listen to me." I said turn around. Frank looked at Tessa. She stood rigid, anger burning behind her eyes, but Briggs was her superior officer. Slowly, Frank turned. Briggs pulled his arms behind him and closed steel handcuffs around his wrists. The click carried through the microphone. A few people gasped. Mayor Hale stepped back from the lectern, satisfied. As Briggs led Frank across the grass, they passed the veterans seated behind the stage. Carl Dawson, a Vietnam veteran in a wheelchair, watched with a hard expression. "Shame on you," Carl called. Briggs kept walking. It was unclear whether Carl meant Frank, the police, or the mayor. Frank was placed in the rear of Tessa's cruiser at the western curb. Briggs shut the door. "You stay here until the ceremony is over." Frank leaned toward the open window. "At least move the people behind the stage." Briggs walked away. Tessa remained beside the car. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be sorry. Check the buildings. I can't abandon my post. This is your post now." She looked toward the stage. The national anthem began. Everyone stood. "Tessa, I heard you." "No, you didn't." She turned back. Frank's voice lowered. "The courthouse was surveillance. The real position will be lower or farther east, Gazette or Foundry. Sloane knows which one. You're sure? No. The honesty unsettled her more than certainty would have. But I would bet my life on it, he said. You already are. No, they're betting theirs. A call came over her earpiece. Tessa touched it, listened, then looked toward the stage. I have to go. Frank sat alone in the patrol car while the ceremony continued. Through the window, he could see only part of the platform. He watched a color guard march across the lawn. He heard applause, speeches, and a high school choir singing beneath the flags. The cuffs pressed against the scars on his wrists. Once, in a concrete room outside Mosul, Frank had spent 9 hours tied to a steel chair while enemy fighters argued over whether he was worth more alive or dead. He had waited then. He waited now. At 10:28, Mayor Hale stepped behind the glass lectern. He spoke about courage. He spoke about sacrifice. He spoke about Rosewood standing behind its heroes. Frank closed his eyes. The crowd became texture. The speakers produced a faint electronic hum. A flag rope tapped against aluminum. Wind moved through sycamore leaves. A child cried near the food trucks. Somewhere behind the stage, a wheelchair brake squeaked. Then came a metallic click from the east. Soft, mechanical, wrong. Frank opened his eyes. A rifle cracked across the plaza. The rear window of the cruiser vibrated. Glass exploded from the mayor's lectern. People screamed. Hale disappeared behind the stage. Frank twisted toward the sound. "Gazette!" he said. A second shot came less than 3 seconds later. It punched through the blue curtain. Not the same sound. The report arrived sharper, with a shorter echo between the brick buildings. Frank turned his head. The first shot had come from the Gazette building. The second had not. A decoy position, a movement route, or 2 shooters. Tessa sprinted toward the cruiser and pulled open the front door to grab the radio. "Shots fired! East side! Everybody down!" "Unlock me," Frank said. She looked through the partition. "Stay low!" The shooter shifted. "What?" First shot. Gazette! Second shot, farther north. Gunfire cracked again. The round struck the stone memorial, throwing white chips across the grass. Frank listened to the echo. Bell Foundry. East roofline. Tessa keyed her radio. Possible shooter at the Bell Foundry. East side. Briggs answered through static. Negative. Reports place him in the Gazette. He moved, Frank said. Tessa repeated it. Who says? Briggs demanded. She looked at Frank. Another shot tore through a banner. Mercer, she answered. Mercer is under arrest. Leave him in the car and follow procedure. On the lawn, civilians crawled beneath folding chairs. Private security guards crouched behind planters, scanning the wrong building. Veterans trapped behind the stage had no clear escape route. Frank leaned toward the partition. Tessa, take the cuffs off. I have a direct order. Then decide what the order is worth. If I release you, I lose my badge. If you don't, someone may lose a child. She looked toward the crowd. Mayor Hale was on the ground behind a planter. Linda Park, the governor's regional representative, remained trapped near the shattered lectern with 2 state troopers. Carl Dawson's wife was trying to pull his wheelchair through cables and audio equipment. Tessa's hand moved toward the key on her belt, then stopped. Tell me what you can do. I can find him. By sound? By sound, impact, and where he wants us looking. Briggs's voice came through her radio. Ramirez, get away from that vehicle and secure the west perimeter. Tessa stared at Frank. Everyone in Rosewood believed the old groundskeeper had become unstable. The mayor had fired him in public. Her commanding officer had told her to leave him cuffed. Trusting Frank could end her career. Not trusting him could end lives. A 4th shot struck the pavement near a family crawling toward cover. Tessa drew the key. If you run, I'll arrest you again. You'll have to catch me. She unlocked the rear door and freed his wrists. Frank stepped out, rubbing one hand. What do you need? She asked. Your radio. Then get those veterans behind the monument. She handed it over. Frank keyed the channel. Units at the Gazette lock down the 4th floor but do not stack in the east stairwell. Secondary shooter is in the Bell Foundry, east roof, likely moving south, a confused officer answered. Who is this? Frank Mercer. Grounds maintenance? Former grounds maintenance. Another rifle shot cracked over the plaza. Frank watched dust rise from the memorial. The impact gave him a line. The echo confirmed it. Foundry, he said. Second opening from the right, behind a steel support. Briggs cut in. Mercer, surrender to the nearest officer. Frank handed the radio back to Tessa. He still thinks I'm the problem. She looked toward the stage. Prove him wrong. Frank ran in a crouch toward the memorial. He reached Carl Dawson first and pulled the wheelchair backward through the tangled cables. Thought they arrested you, Carl said. They did. You escape? Officer error. Tessa arrived and began directing people behind the stone monument. Stay down! Move west! Leave the chairs! Frank looked over the base of the memorial. Near the Gazette alley, a man in a city maintenance vest was carrying a long black case toward the crowd. The man was too clean. His boots had no dust. The city emblem on his vest was last year's design. He saw Frank. For one instant, recognition passed between them. The man dropped the case and moved his hand beneath the vest. Frank pulled a child behind the monument. A shot came from the Bell Foundry. The maintenance worker was not the rifleman. He was a distraction, placed at street level to draw officers away from the real firing position. Frank crawled along the memorial base. Where's the nearest long rifle? He asked Tessa. Patrol marksman kit, Briggs's cruiser. Which one? Eastern curb. Frank studied the open lawn between him and the vehicle. Mayor Hale raised his head from behind the planter. Mercer, he shouted. Do something! Frank looked at the man who had fired him, mocked him, and ordered him handcuffed. I am. A round struck the monument inches above Frank's shoulder. The Bell Foundry was roughly 400 yards away. Broken walls and roof openings provided multiple firing lanes. Apartments stood beyond it, eliminating any careless return shot. Frank watched the dark gaps. A small cloud of dust moved near the east roof line. Then a flash. He ran. 20 feet of open ground separated the monument from Briggs's cruiser. Another shot snapped past him and struck the pavement where his foot had been. Frank reached the trunk. It was locked. He grabbed the radio from a fallen officer's shoulder. Briggs, unlock your cruiser. No, your rifle is in the trunk. You are not touching my weapon. A bullet struck the courthouse clock, showering the steps with fragments. Tessa's voice broke over the channel. Unlock it, Sergeant. Ramirez, you are relieved of duty. Then relieve me after we stop the shooter. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the cruiser's lights flashed and the trunk released. Frank opened the marksman case. Inside lay a bolt-action rifle with a variable power optic. He checked the chamber, settled behind the engine block, and raised the weapon. The scope's elevation setting was wrong. The rifle had likely been bumped during transport. He adjusted it by feel. Tessa crouched beside him. You've used one of these? Not this one. That is not an answer. It's the answer we have time for. He looked through the optic. The shooter had selected a position with apartments behind it. A miss could enter somebody's living room. Frank could not take a shot at a shadow. He needed the man to expose his weapon. Get Hale moving east, Frank said. You said the shooter's east. He expects Hale behind the planter. Movement will force an adjustment? You want to use the mayor as bait? I want to move him towards solid cover. Tessa keyed her radio. Briggs, move the mayor toward the courthouse entrance, low and fast. We're pinned. Frank took the radio. Then stopped waiting for permission. Briggs did not answer. Tessa sprinted to the stage. She grabbed Hale by the collar and dragged him from the planter. Move! I fired that man! Hale shouted. And he's still saving your life. As Hale stumbled east, the gunman adjusted. A black barrel appeared behind a rusted support beam. Frank exhaled. He did not aim at the man. He aimed at the rifle. His first round struck the handguard and drove the barrel upward. The second shattered the scope. The gunman recoiled and vanished. No one cheered. The crowd remained pressed to the ground, afraid even to breathe. A wild shot came from the foundry and smashed into the courthouse clock. Frank cycled the bolt. The shooter was injured, partially blinded and exposed. He would retreat through the rear stairwell rather than cross the roof. Frank keyed the radio. Units approaching the foundry block the south exit. He's moving down. Briggs answered this time. "Copy," Frank turned to Tessa. "I need every irrigation zone at full pressure." She stared at him. "Why?" "Because people hiding in dry buildings don't expect rain," she relayed the order. Seconds later, the memorial sprinklers erupted. Water swept across the lawn, drenching the stage, curtains, chairs, and everyone moving through the open spaces. The spray revealed silhouettes and footprints. Near the Gazette building, the man in the maintenance vest broke into a run. Tessa saw him. "There!" She and another officer rushed toward the alley. The man drew a compact pistol. Frank did not fire. Tessa was too close to his line. "Tessa! Left!" she veered. The suspect turned with her, exposing his flank. A private security guard tackled him into a stack of empty crates. Tessa kicked the pistol away and snapped handcuffs around his wrists. Across the street, officers stormed the Bell Foundry. The rifleman reached the south stairwell exactly as Frank predicted. Briggs and 2 patrol officers met him there. They found him bleeding from one hand and clutching a damaged rifle. He kept shouting that he had been set up. The entire attack lasted less than 4 minutes. For the people of Rosewood, it felt like an hour. They remembered the shattered lectern, the screaming crowd, the water pouring across the stage, and the old groundskeeper kneeling behind a police cruiser with a rifle in his hands. They remembered that he had begun the ceremony in handcuffs. They remembered that the people in charge had laughed at him until bullets proved he had been right. By noon, state police and federal agents had sealed the memorial. Frank sat on the curb beside his maintenance truck. His late brother's suit was soaked, and the red marks from the handcuffs circled his wrists. Tessa brought him a paper cup of coffee. "Briggs wants to know where you learned to shoot. He can ask me. He's embarrassed. He should be. He also says I disobeyed a direct order." "You did." "You could pretend to be grateful." Frank looked at her. "I am grateful. You hide it well. Had practice." She sat beside him. "You hit a rifle at 400 yards with a weapon you'd never fired." "The rifle was large." "You shattered the scope." "Also large." "You identified the new position from inside a patrol car." Frank drank the coffee. "Buildings carry sound." "Not like that." "No." Tessa waited. Frank looked toward the veterans being escorted to safety. "I've had practice," he repeated. Federal agents led the maintenance vest suspect across the lawn. He was about 35, with a shaved head and a bloodied mouth. Then officers brought out the Bell Foundry gunman. Frank recognized him immediately. Colonel David Sloan's gray suit was torn at the shoulder. Blood soaked the towel wrapped around his hand. The polished confidence was gone. Mayor Hale stared at him. "You?" Sloan said nothing. Agent Judith Monroe approached Frank. "Mr. Mercer?" He stood. "I'm Agent Monroe. Are you injured?" "No." "Any medication or alcohol that might affect your recollection?" "No." "Tell me what happened." Frank described the rooftop reflection, the courthouse scrape, the Gazette shot, the second report from the foundry, the false maintenance worker, and Sloan's retreat. He did not mention the black notebook. He did not mention the 6 names crossed out. When he finished, Monroe asked, "Where did you learn to shoot like that? Army. What unit? Special operations. Which one?" Frank looked toward the marble crosses. It was a long time ago. Before Monroe could press him, Mayor Hale approached with a cut above his eyebrow and mud across his jacket. "What is he doing out of custody?" Tessa stood. "I released him. You're suspended." "That's your priority?" Hale pointed at Frank. "He was not authorized to handle that rifle." Monroe's expression cooled. "He used it to stop an active shooter. He acted recklessly. "He saved your life," Tessa said. "Officer Ramirez, watch yourself." Frank raised a hand. He looked at Hale. "Your security team watched the wrong building. They followed the plan. The plan was wrong. You don't get to decide that." "No!" Frank glanced at the ruined stage. "The bullets decided. Agent Monroe stepped between them. Mayor Hale, Colonel Sloan has admitted involvement in planning the attack." Hale turned sharply. "What? He claims he was coerced. We're investigating." The first theory was political. The second was financial. The truth was worse. Sloan had ties to Sentinel Meridian, a private security contractor that had lost a major state contract after investigators uncovered falsified training records and inflated invoices. Linda Park had come to Rosewood to announce an independent audit. Sloan planned to kill her and blame an extremist militia. The resulting chaos would delay the audit and allow Hale to declare an emergency in the redevelopment district. The mayor's office had already prepared to award Sentinel Meridian a no-bid security contract worth $18 million. Hale claimed he knew nothing. His messages said otherwise. Miriam had sent Sloan the ceremony layout, podium location, police deployment, and security blind spots. A text from Hale read, "Make sure the announcement never happens." He insisted he meant that the announcement should be postponed. Few believed him. Frank did not follow the first days of the investigation closely. He returned to the maintenance garage on Monday and found his keycard disabled. His name had been removed from the schedule. Hale's firing order was still technically in effect. Frank stood outside the chain-link gate carrying his lunch thermos and work gloves while reporters filmed him from across the street. After 11 years of tending the memorial, he was not allowed into his own equipment shed. The humiliation hurt more than he expected. Not because he needed the job to define him, because the grass still needed work. A young maintenance employee approached from inside the gate. "I'm sorry, Frank. They said I can't let you in." "I know." "The irrigation controller is showing a fault in Zone 4. Check the solenoid beside Daniel Mercer's cross. The wire corrodes when it rains." The young man nodded and went to look. Frank sat on the curb. A local station offered him $10,000 for an exclusive interview. He declined. A national network offered $20,000. He declined that too. By noon, a federal judge had suspended several city officials. By evening, the city council voted to reinstate Frank with back pay. He returned Tuesday at 6:17 in the morning. The grass had not noticed he had been fired. The Rosewood Gazette ran a front-page headline, "Handcuffed groundskeeper saves ceremony from assassins." The article called Frank a mysterious former Army marksman. That phrase brought the first phone call. It came from a number he did not recognize. Frank answered without speaking. A man said, "You should have stayed buried." Frank looked through his kitchen window. The street was empty. "Who is this? No. You always did lie well," the call ended. Frank wrote the time in his notebook. Then he drove to the police station. Tessa had been placed on paid administrative leave for releasing him, though public pressure made formal punishment unlikely. She listened to his account and leaned forward across her desk. "You need protection." "No." "You're a witness in an attempted assassination." "I told them what I saw." "Someone just threatened you." "People say things." "Frank, stop treating this like a problem you can solve alone. Most problems get worse when more people touch them." "That isn't true." "It is often true." Tessa studied him, then opened a file. "We found something in the Bell Foundry." She slid a photograph across the desk. It showed Sloan's rifle beside its broken scope. A second photograph showed a metal disc marked with a faded symbol, a black circle divided by a vertical line. Frank recognized it. He had seen that symbol in Afghanistan. It belonged to a private network whose members called themselves Night Glass. They were not soldiers, though many had once worn uniforms. They specialized in deniable work, witness removal, staged attacks, disappearances. Frank had hunted them after a mission in Kandahar went wrong. His team had been sent to extract a captured intelligence officer. The officer was dead before they arrived. Someone had sold their route. The ambush killed 5 men. Frank was the only one who came home. The official investigation blamed intercepted communications. Frank never believed it. Now, 25 years later, the black circle had returned. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "In the rifle case. Who handled the weapons?" "Sloan and the street-level suspect. His name is Evan Rusk, former contractor. No official combat record." Frank touched the photograph. "Night glass. What does that mean?" "It means Sloan didn't plan this alone. We need you to tell Agent Monroe everything." "I will, Frank." He met her eyes. "I will." That night, Frank returned to the memorial alone. The police tape had been removed, but muddy evacuation tracks still crossed the lawn. The white crosses stood beneath the moonlight. Near the end of one row was a cross bearing the name Captain Daniel Mercer, Frank's younger brother. Daniel had joined the army because Frank had. He died in Iraq 3 years after Frank left active duty, killed when his convoy was redirected into an ambush. Frank had always believed Daniel's death was one of war's terrible accidents. Now he was no longer sure. A voice came from behind the memorial. "You should have stayed home." Frank did not turn. He looked into the reflection on the polished marble. A man stood 30 feet behind him wearing a dark jacket and baseball cap. A handgun hung low beside his leg. It was the voice from the telephone. "You know me?" Frank asked. "I know the name you buried. Everybody dies." "Not everybody gets to walk away." "Why are you here?" "To remind you what happens when you interfere." Frank turned slightly. "You were at the Gazette." The man smiled. "You saw the rifle." "I saw you." "That's not what you used to say." Frank's eyes narrowed. "You spent 20 years pretending to be nobody," the man continued. "Cutting grass, fixing sprinklers. Did you think the past wouldn't notice? Who sent you?" "You already know. Night glass is gone. Night glass changed names." The man raised the pistol. Frank moved before the weapon cleared his hip. He kicked a loose stone across the pavement. The attacker's eyes flicked toward the sound for less than a second. It was enough. Frank closed the distance, struck the man's wrist, and drove him against the marble wall. The pistol clattered away. The attacker was younger and stronger, but strength meant little once balance disappeared. Frank twisted his arm behind his back. "Who sent you?" A car engine roared from the street. Headlights flooded the memorial. Frank looked toward them. The attacker slammed his head backward. Frank released him just before impact. The man broke free, ran across the grass, and vanished between 2 houses. Frank did not chase. He picked up the pistol. There was no magazine in it. A warning, not an execution. On the grip was the black circle divided by a vertical line. Tessa arrived 12 minutes later. This time, Frank did not argue about protective custody. At the station, Agent Monroe joined them in an interview room. Frank placed the pistol on the table. "Where did you get this?" Monroe asked. "Someone brought it to the memorial." "Describe him." 30 to 40, 6 feet, athletic, left-handed, probably. Scar on the right cheek. Favored his left knee when he ran. Monroe watched him carefully. "You've done this before." "Yes." "Who are you, Frank?" For 25 years, he had answered that question with as little truth as possible. His official records were sealed. At the VA, he was listed as a former infantry officer. On city paperwork, he was simply a groundskeeper. Frank folded his hands. "My name is Franklin Mercer. I served in the United States Army for 22 years. Most of that time was spent in a classified special operations unit." "Which unit?" "Delta Force." Tessa's eyes widened despite herself. Frank continued. "I was a sniper and reconnaissance team leader. I operated under task forces that did not officially exist. The men behind this attack may be connected to Night Glass. And Colonel Sloan? He was never in Delta. Did you serve with him?" "Once. Kandahar, 2001, Frank described the mission. The captured intelligence source. The last-minute route change. The ambush. 5 dead soldiers. Captain David Sloan had been the intelligence liaison. He had insisted the extraction route be altered. Frank questioned the change. Sloan called him paranoid. The team followed the new route. The shooting began 7 minutes later. Sloan had disappeared from the operations center before the ambush and returned after the survivors were evacuated. Frank reported his suspicions. The report vanished. Sloan wasn't recruited after retirement, Frank said. He was working with Night Glass then. Monroe sat back. Why did you leave? I didn't leave the army because of one man. I left the part of myself that believed official answers were always the same as truth. She opened another file. Your brother Daniel was killed when his convoy took a route approved by a private intelligence contractor. Frank's jaw tightened. Sentinel Meridian? He asked. Monroe nodded. We found payments from Sentinel to a shell company controlled by Sloan. That company received funds from a defense firm employing former Night Glass members. The room went quiet. Daniel may not have been a random casualty, Monroe said. For 23 years, Frank had carried his brother's death as part of war. Terrible, but impersonal. Now it had a human shape. The anger came slowly. That made it more dangerous. Tessa reached across the table. Frank! I'm fine. No, you're not, he looked at her hand. No, he said. It was the first honest answer he had given her. The investigation moved quickly. Sloan's phones contained encrypted messages, payment records, and photographs of Rosewood's security layout. Rusk had been hired to create a false threat and draw police toward the Gazette building while Sloan fired from the Foundry. The first shot had been remotely triggered from a fixed rifle in the Gazette office. Sloan fired the rest. That was why Frank heard the position shift, even though witnesses saw no one crossing between buildings. Hale's involvement was proved through financial records and messages. Miriam agreed to testify in exchange for consideration, admitting that the mayor had ordered her to give Sloan the security plans. 3 days later, a hospital in West Virginia admitted a man matching Frank's description of the attacker from the memorial. He had crashed on a wet highway, fracturing his knee and wrist. Inside his jacket was a stitched black circle. His name was Marcus Vale. He refused to speak until Agent Monroe placed Frank's name on the table. Then he asked for a deal. Vale told federal investigators that Night Glass had evolved into a private network serving wealthy clients who needed problems erased. Sloan was one of several American intermediaries. A defense contractor facing exposure over illegal surveillance agreements had funded the Rosewood attack. The contractor needed chaos, a dead state official, and public pressure for expanded security spending. Sloan provided the plan. Hale provided access. Vale had been assigned to kill Frank after the ceremony because Night Glass knew who he was. They had monitored him for nearly 2 years. They had watched him mow the memorial lawn, watched him live alone, watched him visit Daniel's cross, watched him become invisible. Mayor Hale resigned before federal indictments were announced. He was convicted of conspiracy, fraud, obstruction, and attempted murder. Colonel Sloan pleaded guilty after prosecutors confronted him with the restored Kandahar records and Vale's testimony. He received 27 years in federal prison. Sentinel Meridian lost every government contract it held. The defense contractor's executives were indicted. Sergeant Briggs received a formal reprimand for dismissing the threat assessment and failing to secure the Bell Foundry. Tessa was cleared of wrongdoing after investigators concluded that releasing Frank had prevented mass casualties. When the police chief reinstated her, he asked whether she would disobey the order again. Yes, sir, she said. He stared at her for several seconds. Try not to make a habit of it. The story that spread across the country was simpler than the investigation. An old groundskeeper saw a glint. A mayor laughed at him, fired him, and had him arrested. Then the bullets came. News crews camped outside Frank's house. He ignored them. One morning, Agent Monroe found him planting chrysanthemums near the memorial. We recovered something, she said. She handed him a declassified report from 2002. The original Kandahar mission records had been altered. A paragraph had been removed from the final copy. The restored version named Captain David Sloan as the officer who ordered the route change. It also confirmed that the ambush had been coordinated with night glass. Frank read the paragraph twice. Then he closed the file. Daniel's name isn't here. No, then it doesn't change what happened. It changes who was responsible. Frank pressed soil around a flower. For him? For you. I don't need a document to know my brother mattered. Will you testify at Sloan's sentencing? Yes. Why? Because the truth should be in the room when he hears the sentence. The sentencing took place in Richmond. Families of the 5 soldiers killed in Kandahar filled the courtroom. Frank sat in the front row. Sloan looked older. His shoulders had collapsed, and his hair had thinned. He no longer resembled a colonel, consultant, or man who always knew which door to use. He looked like someone who had run out of places to hide. When Frank's name was called, he walked to the podium. The courtroom expected vengeance. Frank gave them truth. David Sloan betrayed men who trusted him. He helped arrange their deaths and then built a career using the language of service. That betrayal cannot be repaired by a sentence, confession, or apology. Sloan lowered his eyes. But justice is not revenge, Frank continued. Revenge would make his choices the center of our lives. They are not. He turned toward the families. The men who died were not defined by how they were betrayed. They were defined by what they did for one another. That is what should be remembered. Frank did not speak to reporters after sentencing. He returned to Rosewood and went back to work. By spring, the city had rebuilt its veterans' ceremony. The veterans' seating was placed in front. The mayor's brass plaque was removed. In its place, the council installed a simple stone engraved with the names of Rosewood residents who had served. No politician's name appeared on it. Money recovered from the redevelopment scandal funded a memorial garden. The council asked Frank to design it. He refused. Then Carl Dawson came to his house and parked his wheelchair at the kitchen table. "You owe us," Carl said. "For what? For letting them put us behind the stage. That wasn't my decision. But you let it happen," Frank sighed. Carl leaned forward. "You know the problem with heroes? I'm not one. They always say that. I was handcuffed in a police car." "And you still did more than everyone on that stage." Frank looked away. Carl pointed toward the window. "You saw danger before anyone else. You stepped into it after they laughed at you. You stopped a murderer without killing him. Then you sat in the mud and asked whether anybody had died. That was the relevant question. That isn't the impressive part. The impressive part is that, after all of it, you still care where the chairs go." A month later, the garden opened. Frank planted white roses around a low stone wall. Tessa attended with her mother. Agent Monroe stood near the back and refused every interview. The ceremony was smaller than Hale's spectacle. There were no donors on stage, no television backdrop, no speeches claiming ownership of sacrifice, only veterans, families, police officers, and citizens beneath the flags. After Frank planted the final rose, Tessa approached. "Someone wants you to speak." "No. You haven't asked who. Doesn't matter. It's the governor." "No. She wants to give you the Virginia Medal of Public Service." "I don't need a medal." "I know." "She can give it to someone else." Tessa held out an envelope. Inside was a photograph taken minutes after the attack. Frank was kneeling beside the memorial in his soaked suit. The police rifle rested across his knees. Red handcuff marks showed on his wrists. Behind him, veterans were being led to safety. Carl Dawson sat in his wheelchair, looking directly at Frank. On the back, someone had written, "They put you in cuffs. You still didn't leave us in the back." Frank read the sentence twice. "You don't have to accept it for yourself," Tessa said. "Who gets it? The Veterans Assistance Fund. The medal is just a ceremony." "Then I'll attend," she smiled. "I thought you hated ceremonies." "I hate bad ones." 6 weeks later, the governor presented the medal. Frank stood at the podium in a clean suit. His old army decorations were pinned beneath the American flag. For the first time, Rosewood learned what he had been. The newspapers called him a Delta Force sniper, a hidden hero, and a living legend. Frank disliked every description. After the ceremony, a reporter asked what it felt like to receive recognition after so many years in obscurity. Frank looked toward the garden. I wasn't in obscurity, the reporter waited. I was working. The answer traveled across the country. Some called it humble. Others called it mysterious. Frank meant it literally. He had been working, keeping grass alive, repairing sprinklers, pulling weeds from around names carved in stone, protecting one small corner of the world in the only way he knew. Months later, on a cold November morning, Frank stood alone at the memorial with pruning shears. Frost silvered the grass. He trimmed a dead branch from a rosebush, then walked to Daniel's cross. For years, Frank had believed redemption meant forgiving himself for surviving. He no longer believed that. Survival was not a debt. It was a responsibility. The dead did not ask the living to suffer forever. They asked them to remember. A cruiser stopped at the curb. Tessa stepped out carrying 2 coffees. "Morning," she said. "Morning." She handed him a cup. "I brought breakfast." "I'm not hungry. It's a bagel. Nobody's hungry until they smell a bagel." Frank accepted it. Tessa looked across the memorial. "You ever think about leaving?" "Leaving what? Rosewood, the job." All this, Frank considered the question. The mayor was gone. Sloane was in prison. The men who once laughed at him now nodded when he passed. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked grateful. But the memorial remained. The names remained. The grass still grew. "No," he said. "Why not?" Frank looked toward the white roses moving in the wind. "Someone has to keep watch." "Against what?" He scanned the courthouse roof, the Gazette windows, the broken outline of the bell foundry. Then he looked down at the flower bed. "Mostly weeds," Tessa laughed. Frank took a bite of the bagel. For a long time, neither spoke. The sun rose over Rosewood, warming the marble crosses and turning frost into water. A school bus stopped at the corner. A child in a red coat climbed aboard. A woman carried groceries across the street. A delivery driver waved at Frank as he passed. The world continued. That was the miracle. Not that Frank Mercer could strike a rifle at 400 yards. Not that he could hear a battlefield hidden inside an ordinary city street. Not even that he had survived the men who betrayed him. The miracle was that after everything he had seen, Frank had chosen to remain gentle. He had chosen flowers. He had chosen quiet work. He had chosen to protect people who might never understand what it cost. And when the city finally learned what he had been, Frank did not ask for praise. He asked only that they remember the names on the crosses, because true heroes do not measure their lives by how loudly the world applauds. They measure them by who makes it home.